Okay, wonderful. We're going to get started here in just a moment. So thank you so much, first of all, for joining this event. This is Building to a Billion, the Resilient Housing Implementation Lab. I am so thrilled to have all of you, especially our speakers here today. I wanted to also thank the Marrakesh Partnership and the Buildings Pavilion, as well as the Race to Resilience for their collaboration in making this event happen. I wanted to first frame our event by talking a little bit about the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda, which was launched earlier this week by the high-level champions. So this is a series of events, or a series of actions and ambitions that were launched by the high-level champions that are catalyzing more progress in the resilience sector. And for us, working in resilient housing, this is incredibly important. One of the actions launched was for that 1 billion people by 2030 have better access to design, construction, and access to finance to live in decent, safe, affordable, and climate resilient homes. So that is what we are here to talk about today. How do we reach this 1 billion number? How do we advance collaboration across sectors, across governments, across implementers to better catalyze action in the resilient housing space? So just to introduce myself, I am Monica Schrader. I am Build Change's Director of Global Advocacy. And along with my colleague, Sarah Bush, we'll be moderating this event today. We have a really exciting lineup of speakers. And I will pass it to Sarah to introduce.
Perfect. Thank you all for being here and for being part of this important conversation. Build Change has been operating for 18 years in 25 different countries around the world, and we've been able to strengthen 200,000 homes, which means that 1 million people today are living in safer housing. And so we've been able to protect $4 billion in assets, but none of this would be possible without partners. So we've invited partners from the private sector, the public sector, from philanthropy, to come together today and to talk about how we're here to serve people and how we can come together in service to those who are most vulnerable and who are on the front lines of this climate crisis that we currently face. One of the things that I wanted to do is to share about how we get this work done, and we really focus in 3 areas. We look at what we call P, so people and policy, to be able to do this work. We know we need money. We've got to bring resources to the table in order to make this work happen. And then we also use technology to understand how we can better strengthen buildings that are in local communities and use local materials and building supplies and knowledge to be able to meet people where they're at. And so combining those 3 techniques, we're able to go in and quickly assess buildings post-disaster, but also to work on the prevention side, making buildings more resilient before the next one strikes. And so we're thrilled that you can be with us today and to be part of this critical conversation as we look to expand resilient housing around the globe. So I'm honored today to introduce Same Waba, and he is the Regional Director for Sustainable Development at the World Bank's Europe and Central Asia region. In this capacity, he oversees all World Bank lending, technical assistance, partnerships, and policy advisory work in sustainable development in the region, including agriculture and food, climate change, environment, natural resources, and the blue economy, social inclusion and sustainability, water, urban disaster risk management, resilience, and land. He oversees a portfolio of $10 billion in lending commitments and a team of 200 professionals based in Washington, D.C., and 23 regional offices. He holds a PhD in urban planning from Harvard University and has 25 years experience in urban development, land, housing, disaster risk management, infrastructure, and sustainable development. He's a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Cities Council and sits on the boards of Cities Alliance, Resilient Cities Network, and the WRI Ross Center for Cities. Welcome.
Hi everyone. I'm sorry you had to endure, a very long introduction. I thought these things are. What I wanted to share with you today is a program that we've had at the World Bank called the Global Program for Resilient Housing, and that's the program that we have a partnership with Build Change, among other organizations and it will share with you a little bit of our thinking at the World Bank about about the resilience of housing. So a few facts and figures. First, as you know, I mean, the world is urbanizing really fast. We're talking about, 55% of the world's urban population living in cities today, a figure that's going to increase to about 70% by 2050, which more or less translates to somewhere between 2.5 to 2.8 billion people over the coming, 20 odd years that will be moving into cities. And among others, will be looking for housing, jobs, services, and so on and so forth. Now, this is not only the housing challenge, because I mean, if that challenge alone means that we need to move the entire population of Turkey, 85 million, we need to move them into cities every year. But this assumes that, cities are housing people and people are living in, adequate living conditions, which is not the case. You've got another billion people who are living in slums and therefore living in housing conditions that will require improvement. So you start taking all that, we're talking more or less about the need to provide maybe about 100,000 housing units per day in order to be able to catch up quickly on the deficit and prepare for the future. So that is a combination of needing to provide new housing, I mean, in places that, are already, built in accordance with an adequate density, so an expansion, new greenfield housing, but also quite a bit of retrofit. Now, one of the challenges that we came to realize, that on the one hand, the large majority of housing subsidies by government go for new housing construction, except that, an investment that would cost about a third or even less into housing retrofit has the capacity to bring about much better improvements, to make housing units much more livable, but also to strengthen the resilience of those housing units, which might allow them to expand, to accommodate additional tenants, etc. So an investment into making an affordable housing unit resilient and much more, if you will, resilient to disaster risk, to climate risk, enables an expansion of the housing stock, by property owners to accommodate, maybe to build an additional rental units, to expand the units, etc. So when we started looking at, how housing subsidies are allocated versus, where you might be able to achieve much more with the same amount or the dollar amount, then, there was a much stronger case for retrofit. Second, I mean, in a context of a disaster, and every time there is a disaster, a flood, an earthquake, what have you, we do post-disaster needs assessment where we look at the damages, the economic losses, etc. And invariably, the housing sector constitutes anywhere between 40 to 90% of the private damages that occur in just about the aftermath of any earthquake or flood or so. Therefore, also, there is a very important need to invest in the retrofitting of the housing sector. So we started at the World Bank a program, a global program to try to support the governments that we work with on A, trying to assess the extent of the challenge, and then B, try to think about what to do about it. So we've put together basically an artificial intelligence supported system that uses a combination of a drone and camera mounted on a car to create basically a three-dimensional image of the city. So you get, the facades by the camera, and you get the roofs by the drones. You combine the images and you constitute more or less a three-dimensional image of the city. And then you bring structural engineers who are, used to the housing construction to start inputting, basically identifying the typologies of construction, whether it's the quality of the roofs, of the building materials, or the width of the openings, the spans, that could lend themselves to putting a housing unit in more of a risk of collapse in the context of an earthquake. So, and basically you start running this algorithm to figure out, to identify potential areas of risk within a city. When we did that with the first, I think two of our first cases was basically in Guatemala City and in St. Lucia. Then we ended up sending structural engineers to inspect the housing stock to tell us from their inspection which units are liable to collapse. We compared the two, we found that we have an ability to get the right detection at about 80–85%. It means we cannot tell you unit by unit which one is going to fall, but we can tell you more or less this area, there's a heightened risk that a disaster could contribute, so that you can talk to the policymakers about starting to put in place a program to help avert this. Because at the end of the day, I mean, government is the insurer of last resort. You know, if a housing collapses, I mean, government will have to go compensate people, intervene, you know, and there's obviously a tremendous amount of cost to the economy, to the livelihoods, to the welfare of people. So intervening upfront with a subsidy program that could create incentives for the households to retrofit their housing becomes a much smarter way, or a much more judicious way, of the use of resources. We started putting in place a few programs like this in Colombia, in Mexico, in Peru, in Indonesia, where the government provides a subsidy per housing unit in areas that are liable, you know, that are areas of heightened risk, so that the housing owners would profit from the subsidy, put their own matching amount of money, and be able to retrofit the housing unit, both for structural resilience, but at the same time with an allowance for also livelihood improvements. I mean, the households wants to brace the roof, maybe, but at the same time they may want to expand, put this additional bathroom, you know. So it becomes therefore, you know, a subsidy that supports both a livelihood improvement, but at the same time also the greater goal, which is the government objective of resilience. At the end of the day, I mean, you know, now we're starting to see the first evaluations, I mean, the impact in terms of the improvement of the housing units, but also the way these improvements are trigger, if you will, a larger neighborhood improvement, and therefore, if you will, an additional densification, construction, etc. Now, of course, that is not the solution to everything. There's much more dimensions in there. I mean, there's, you know, we're talking here about the resilience policy of the government, but there's also the housing policy of the government. And, you know, access to housing, you know, whether it's affordable or not affordable, hinges on a variety of factors. It hinges on whether access to land is feasible, is not feasible. In many places, in a place like Kenya, for instance, you know, land constitutes about 60% of total development cost. It's because the land market is so distorted that to be able to have land that has clear title, it makes the housing unit much more expensive than, you know, the median household would be able to afford. Hence, you know, the perpetuation of informality, where, you know, because at the end of the day, I mean, the choice that a poor person that lives in a developing country city faces is usually a trade-off between the livability of the housing unit or the location, which in other words means access to opportunity. So if they want to be close to where the jobs are, chances are, you know, land is not available. So the only land that's available is on slopes that are, you know, liable to collapse, on floodplains, on marginal land like a garbage dump, etc. And that's the only way to be close to where an economic opportunity is, and they give up their own livability. But if they want to go and get a decent housing unit that might be affordable, they're 2–3 hours away from the city center, and therefore they'll get the livability minus the opportunity. So that trade-off, you know, is something that a housing policy would need to look, and a housing policy would need to look both at the demand side and the supply side. So you've got two sets of policies that will need to intersect over here. You know, a resilience policy and a housing policy that combined would hopefully create much more demand for government intervention to, you know, strengthen, to boost the resilience of the housing stock, and hopefully, you know, improve living conditions for poor people. Sorry, I went on a big ramble in there. Happy to contribute to the conversation and talk a lot about our projects at the World Bank. But thank you all.
Yeah, this is great. I'm a little shorter than Sumit, so I have to lower this. No, this is great, and I think this frames really nicely some of the topics that we're going to cover today, from, you know, global policy to local implementation, from supply and demand. So for the next segment, I'd love to invite my colleague Sarah Bush, as well as Vijal Brahmbhatt from the Mahila Housing Trust, to have a chat around housing, heat, and women. Sarah and Vijal, please take it away.
Yes, thanks so much. So I wanted to introduce Bijal Brahmbhatt, who is the director of the Mahila Housing Trust in India. Her work of over 20 years in cities has been in areas of formal, informal, and invisible governance for housing and habitat. Her programs have helped women participate in city-level initiatives, a small step to make cities inclusive. Bijal, could you share with us today what are some of the greatest challenges that individuals, and in particular the women that you work with, are facing, and how are you shifting the power to give them more of a voice?
We work with poor women, and most of these women are informal workers. And since they are informal workers, I think about 40 million in our country, at least 40 million of them are at least working from their house. And so their house becomes their workplace, their go down, their production house. And all these houses, because they are poor, are made of tin sheets and cement sheets, and essentially have no ventilation, very dark, etc. And of course, no security of tenure in certain cases. And we found that their productivity was essentially reducing. So their house was their productive asset, and unless and until you improve the housing, their economic productivity would reduce quite a lot. And now, given the climate change situation, we were finding that it was even further getting deteriorated because of the kind of heat stress, because of flooding. Their houses were getting impacted. Excess rain has become a big issue. And so there are two ways that we work with them. One is, housing is, so most housing in India is actually done incrementally. People build themselves. So how do you provide housing finance to them, especially because it's informal income and informal tenure. You don't have legal titles, and therefore no formal financing institutions will actually provide housing finance to them. So we have created women's own cooperatives which sort of accumulate their own savings and then give back loans for incremental housing finance. And to that, we have added the elements of how do you sort of, introduce elements like cool roofs, painting solutions which reflect sun rays, rooftop ventilations, and some of these elements get financed through. And so it has to be a combination of education as well as financing for them to be able to adopt this. On the other hand, our own government, which is the biggest provider of housing, we have traditionally facilitated between the communities and the government so that they get better access through government housing policies. And on the other hand, we also try and improve policies of the government housing policies. Now, the key issue here with our women, I'm sorry, I hope you don't have any other question. I'm just
No,
going
that's
on
great. Yeah.
storytelling. So the key issue we found was that currently our government is having a 20 million housing program for the low income. And all those housing that was being churned out, the moment the women moved there, their electricity usage was almost double, triple. Two reasons. One was, of course, that they were aspirational, and so they brought things like, mechanized things like mixtures, etc., refrigerators. And one was because, these houses were really not looking at heat and not addressing the thermal comfort. So, and the issue was that we did have building codes, but the building codes, which prescribed green buildings, were so ideally designed that the cost would actually first increase by 20 to 30%. So the Affordable Housing Ministry was not actually talking to the green building codes, and therefore we realized that we needed to come up with passive design solutions with materials which were available in the market for the government to sort of construct those houses, but at the same time would not increase the cost as much. So the complexity was that they would reduce the heat but not increase the cost so much. So how do you then merge this passive design with the available material in the markets, which would not essentially be the ideal green building, but still a level would be achieved which was much better than earlier. Otherwise, it would have huge cost implications. And developing countries and poorer countries do have to consider cost implications when we talk of resilience building. You have the pot of money which has to be pulled everywhere, and then you have to work with that. So we then made a great advocacy for having graded building codes, because either you were, in the name of why not give everything, they were not giving anything, because the cost was so exorbitant. So these are some of the ways we have been trying to work to bring the voices of our women into really getting better housing for the communities.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to hear about all of the innovations, both in finance and also technology and policies at the government level. So we thank you for your good work and wish you the best.
All right. Thank you. I think, as a side note, Build Change was founded shortly after the earthquake in Gujarat. So that incident and that disaster really means a lot to us in our personal history, and we're happy to be collaborating with organizations like the Mahila Housing Trust. So for our next segment, I'd love to invite Daniel Stander and Francine Barron to the stage. I'll introduce them briefly. Okay, I promise. It'll be brief. I will humor them and introduce very, very briefly. Francine Barron is the CEO of the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica. Among other things, she's tasked for supporting the implementation of Dominica's Climate Resilience Recovery Plan and has a very impressive resume, which includes Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs and Principal Advisor to the Government of Dominica. And for her sake, I'll leave it there, but it's quite impressive. And then turning to Daniel Stander, he is a special advisor to the United Nations on matters of risk, analytics, and finance. He is on the board of the Resilient Cities Network, and for his sake, I'll end it there. But also an impressive resume and a longtime friend of Build Change, so thank you both for joining us today. I wanted to start with Francine, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the situation in Dominica after Hurricane Maria. How did it affect, Dominica as a nation? And also, you've set the plan to become the first climate resilient nation. How are you doing that? It's an ambitious goal, and I like it.
Thank you very much, Monica, and good afternoon to all of you. Dominica would have been devastated by successive storms, a tropical storm in 2015 and Hurricane Maria in 2017. So combined with the two, we would have suffered about 300% loss of GDP with both storms. The worst one would have been Hurricane Maria, which was a Category 5 storm. That Category 5 storm affected the entire island. We were without power, without water. Access roads were blocked. There are some communities that took over a year to have electricity and internet restored. We suffered about 90% of homes being either damaged or destroyed, 3,500 completely destroyed, and others suffering different levels of damage. Livestock, crops were affected, and really the country was shut down literally for about a week with no activity taking place at all, and then slowly we began to emerge from it. The Prime Minister, within about 3 days of Hurricane Maria in 2017, would have addressed the United Nations, and he then expressed the vision for Dominica to become the first climate resilient nation, knowing that we will continue to suffer from extreme weather events as climate change continues and perhaps gets worse, because our actions are not designed to limit what is happening. In fact, it's making it worse. And we decided that we would look at resilience building in a holistic manner. How do we ensure that our institutions are aligned with our resilience agenda? How do we ensure that we have environmental, economic, infrastructure resilience? So looking at it in a holistic way, we developed a national resilience development strategy and then a climate resilience recovery plan, which required all actors, both within the government and within the private sector, to be on board and to be acting and moving in the same direction. And for us, that has meant that we have to look at institutionalizing resilience, so ensuring that all government's plans and policies are aligned to the resilience targets, and that the private sector is also informed of what is necessary to build their own resilience as well. And of course, importantly, looking at how do you make your infrastructure more resilient, which is the really expensive part of it. And so we would have revised our building codes immediately after Hurricane Maria, so that people, when they were building after repairing and rebuilding their homes, that they would employ better standards of building, and hopefully buildings that can withstand hurricanes of that magnitude in the future. And in rebuilding our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, we had to look at building them differently, building them stronger, building them higher, building them wider and longer, so that, you know, you would have enough of passage for water and debris from trees and so on to pass without affecting the entire structure. So that's just, in a nutshell, some of the work that we've been doing. It is something that will take some time, and of course you're limited by how much funding you have to move quickly. But it's something that requires government to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So government has committed to building 5,000 climate resilient homes by 2025. So some of that is being done. We would have had support from the World Bank in relation to some of the housing for the more vulnerable, and government would have provided support of materials and technical support to some people to rebuild as well. But it is a massive task, so it's a work in progress.
Yeah, no, I can definitely imagine. Daniel, do you want to talk a little bit about how some of these considerations play into your work? I mean, there's a discussion of resilient finance, infrastructure upgrading, government engagement. I feel like a lot of these relate to things that you've been addressing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I actually don't even know where to begin, because that was so rich. There are so many topics. I almost want to just kind of lay out the map and what I heard. Right? I heard, if we could speak about a specific situation, we heard a country that understands that it needs to work ex ante up front on its resilience, but as you said, it needs to have a plan in place for recovery. We heard a country that understands that there's all types of housing. There's residential housing all the way through to infrastructure. We heard that when we think about recovery, or we think about the ex post, there are many, many different phases: response, rebuild, economic recovery. We heard that the situation is getting worse. It is urgent, that the frequency and severity of the impacts is changing before our eyes. And then I also heard, and this is maybe the point, that you need money. How do we afford this, or how do you afford this? That, to me, is the key question. And when you're trying to change anything, you need to understand the stakeholders, align incentives, align interests, and then incentivize the change. And Same said, quite rightly, that governments, unfortunately, are the insurers of last resort. And I think that one of the things we need to do here is understand whose balance sheet is this problem sitting on. We can cost the risk, and the idea that it is currently uninsured is not true. It is insured unwittingly by the government, and that has a massive economic cost and human cost. And when we think about what happens, I'm trying to remember what percentage of your GDP you lost in Maria. It was like 226% of the nation's GDP was wiped out in a couple of days. So what that then does to a couple of hours, and then what that then does to sovereign debt, and where that puts you in terms of your own plans for ongoing operational budget to deliver the services you need to serve, but your capital plan for the infrastructure changing. I mean, we need to change the system. Now, I think it's not impossible to mobilize private capital to be interested in what I would say is the resilience dividend associated with making the kinds of changes that you're talking about. And I think that money is there and waiting on the wings. I heard, I think it was your chief of staff, talking about what you do as your 3 pillars, but the last one was technology. And there's a lot of work that can be done in understanding the risk and then quantifying the resilience benefits and taking it to the markets for some blended financing solutions that will do 2 things. And I'm pleased we have a microfinance institution in place here. We need to incentivize the lending with global lenders to make that leveraged. And I'm sure the defaults on your loans are negligible. I'm sure they are. But I'm sure you don't get the credit that you deserve, and they are negligible because it's community lending and it's based on trust. But that doesn't translate, but we can make that translate to move capital from global lenders that will give you the scale to make the lending that will allow, I'm looking at Juan, I don't know why I'm looking at Juan, to deliver on the retrofits that we know are more cost effective, that will protect the lives. And I'm sure, because I see insurers in the room as well, that can help hedge the risk and encourage that money to come in, but also defray some of the risks, so that when this happens, not only are you hopefully in a better place because you've got a more resilient community, but you don't have to go, and Sammy, I don't mean this in the wrong way, you don't have to then go cap in hand in a moment of distress to your sovereign lenders to try and refinance the entire economy. If we get it right, we can change the entire system, and I believe it's doable. I don't think what I'm talking about is magic. I think it's all there around aligning those incentives. I'm getting lots of nods in the room, which is reassuring. So maybe I'll leave it there for now.
No, that's helpful, Daniel. And I think, this speaks to a lot of the challenges that we wrestle with as implementers in the housing space. Is how do we understand the scope of this financial problem, and how do we value it so that it is incentivized, that there are investments. And I think something that comes to mind for me is that, we often think about what do we mean by financing resilient housing? Yes, we mean labor, we mean materials. We also mean technical assistance. It's an aspect of the solution that is often overlooked. We also mean funding for advocacy, for getting the word out there so that there is a better understanding of, what the kinds of impacts are that are affecting countries like Dominica. So now looking back at my notes, I wanted to also ask a little bit about loss and damage. I feel like we were talking a lot about loss and damage in this COP. And I wanted to get a sense from you, Francine, on what are some of the goals of the Caribbean community within this financing space? I think one of the things that we wrestle with often is, of course there's a need for loss and damage funding. I think it's something that a lot of people are recognizing, if not before, then certainly now. But also, how do we prevent that loss and damage in the first place? And how do we balance those goals? I'm happy to hear your thoughts on it.
Great, thank you. And I mean, this is a very interesting discussion, because when you think of an individual who has, let's say, a job that's affected by the storm, who has children to look after, and you say to that person, look, you need to build back and build back resilient. The question they're going to ask you is, who's going to pay for it? Of course, I would like to have resilient homes, but who's going to pay for it? Where am I going to find the money to do it? And so even I like the idea that Daniel has in relation to mobilizing the resources. But are we mobilizing it in such a way that government again has to step in order for it to be effective? And when we're dealing with governments who continuously have to put money out up front to be able to respond to these same events, the additional funding is just not there, or the commitment that they would have to make, it's not possible, because after responding to each of these events, your debt keeps climbing. And what has made that debt much worse is COVID. So the actions that governments had to take to respond to COVID for us, we moved from, I think, about 80% to over 100% to respond to COVID. This is after we were already struggling with responding to Hurricane Maria. So, so you have the natural events, and then you have events like the pandemic to deal with. Now, just to come back to your question on loss and damage, uh, there's funding available for mitigation and adaptation. Most of that funding is loan funding. And go back to the debt issue. Governments are not able, or it's not reasonable to expect government to continue to borrow and borrow to respond to issues like housing, where people's homes are damaged as a result of an extreme weather event that really and truly is exacerbated by the actions of others. So you have to find a mechanism where funding is made available to allow people, the individuals, to be able to do the changes that are required to their homes to make it more resilient, so that they're not continuously in a situation where, you know, the children are put out, they are put out, and they're continuously struggling to be able to just live. And the pressure, and Sammy is right, the government becomes the insurer of last resort. You have to find the funds to be able to help persons. And you find yourself continuously in a build, destroy, rebuild cycle that is bankrupting governments, really, when you think about it. So there has to be a facility, a mechanism that's put in place that allows people to have the funding that is necessary to minimize their losses and to respond to the losses that they've already suffered. And so what is the ideal mechanism for that? And it cannot be loan funding. If we're talking loan funding, then you're going to find that a lot of people are still going to be in the same situation because governments cannot borrow anymore. And so how do you create that mechanism, whether it is through the private sector or through a special fund that's created to allow people to be able to access the funding to make the changes that are required?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I'll just jump in and pass to you, Daniel. I think that, you know, something that we think about a lot is, you know, there is this need for a subsidy-based solution right now. As it currently stands, we need government subsidies to be supporting housing. There's also a need for a market-based solution. I know that Daniel was referencing also microfinance solutions, that there needs to be an investor that's willing to take this first loss or this risk so that microfinance institutions are able to provide this service for incremental home improvements to a greater number of people within their clientele, often people that they trust, often clients that they already exist. But this market-based solution also needs to have the opportunity to grow even more. I think it's, you know, right now as it stands within the housing sector, it is relatively limited. It's not as prevalent as subsidy solutions. And so how do we incentivize the public sector to make these kinds of investments so that microfinance can have this space, this room to thrive, I think is a big question. Daniel.
They have the incentives. The incentives are clear. We need to enable them to be able to afford it. It's not an issue of capital availability, it's capital affordability and aligning interests. I want to make 3 quick points. Your question was around loss and damage. A thorny and important issue. I ask we reframe it, not because I'm ducking the issue, I want to frame this as an issue of climate justice. That's what it is. Hasn't been spoken about here on this panel, but it's super important. If you go loss and damages, then it's whose fault is it? Am I to blame? You know, actually, the real issue is that the climate crisis will disproportionately impact those who are most vulnerable. Everybody can agree with that. So it is then incumbent upon us to disproportionately support those who are most vulnerable, least able to pay, and most likely to be affected. Agreed? Good. That's climate justice. The next thing I want to say is I think there is a large amount of private capital that wants to get involved. And I don't know why in your own situation you haven't found that yet, but I don't think you should be footing the bill, and I think there are others who would like to do that and who have incentives to do that. And just as a little coda on that second point, I'm so pleased that we're here 12 months after we launched the Race to Resilience, that we launched to rebalance, if you will, the discussion at COPs from one that was, I'll flip it round, one where the adaptation agenda was not being discussed at all. Now, it's understandable because this is a place where we come and we talk primarily about greenhouse gas reductions and what we can agree on mitigation. But what we're now seeing is the adaptation agenda rising and corporate investors being incentivized, perhaps as they were initially, to buy carbon credits, another thorny issue that I'm not going to go into, but are incentivized to be investing in resilience building initiatives where they will pay and they will put their money on the line. And then that leads me to my third point, which is I think we need to fundamentally change some of the norms about how financial products work. I'll give one example, which is the insurance example. And Francine, you and I have spoken about this before, so forgive me that you have to listen to this again. But typically in insurance products, there's the policyholder, there's the person that pays the premium, and there's the person that receives the funds in the payout. Normally, that's the same person. I'm the policyholder on my house, I pay the premiums, and I receive the payout. It doesn't have to be that way. And there are plenty of people who are willing to smash that open, where the policyholder could be the government, where the person who pays the premiums could be philanthropic stroke corporate, because there are reasons why they want to do that. And the beneficiary, money goes straight into the hands of the homeowners, if that's what's needed, as a little check to keep them going, to help with their livelihoods. But also, the beneficiary could, at the same time, depending on how you structure it, be the government in order to perhaps have a period of forgiveness on their sovereign debt, or perhaps to have an injection of funds to deal with the emergency response, whatever is required. So I think if we just slightly change the way we think about structuring financial products, then we can address this issue, and we can finally, I think, begin to address the issue of climate justice too.
I couldn't agree more. So that is a great conclusion, actually, to this panel. Thank you both so much for joining me. I think that this is a really important discussion to be having. And yeah, I encourage us to, keep thinking about these kinds of financial solutions as we continue both this event and this COP. We still have a long ways to go with this COP, and that means there's a lot of opportunity still. So I will now pass to thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I'll pass to my colleague, Sarah, who will be moderating our next segment.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Monica. So next we want to talk about accelerating action for system transformation. And so I heard the plea for short bios and more good conversation. So I'd like to start with Magali Anderson, who's the Chief Sustainability and Innovation Officer at Wholesome. And I'll just share that she started her career as a field engineer on offshore oil rigs in Nigeria, kicking off her 27-year career in the oil and gas industry prior to joining Wholesome. So welcome. I'll also welcome to the stage Charlie Langdale, the head of Howden's Climate Risk and Resilience Division, which will focus on risk transfer products to help accelerate and de-risk the move towards a low-carbon economy. And then last but not least, my esteemed colleague, Juan Caballero. He's Build Change's Vice President of Programs, and he's been with the organization over 10 years now. He first started with us following the devastating 2010 earthquake in Haiti. So welcome, Juan. So we've talked so far about the importance of accelerating action around resilient housing, but I want to address how net zero plays a parallel role. Can you tell me how you're advancing net zero goals while still prioritizing resilience, especially in climate vulnerable areas? So Magali, let's start with you. I'd love to hear about the decarbonization solutions that Wholesome is advancing.
Wow, after what we just heard, what a fantastic discussion we just heard, Francine, with Daniel, I feel really humbled about talking about net zero pledge of Wholesome, frankly. But sorry, I have to, so please bear with me. It's not as exciting as your story, but So yes, we at Holcim, we make a lot of building material, a lot of cement, a lot of concrete, which, as we heard, is badly needed in a lot of places, but it's also badly needed to do it as near zero as possible. So we actually, exactly 3 hours and a half ago, we just announced that we were one of the first cement company to get our 1.5 degree validated by SBTi from a roadmap that only exists since August. So only 3 companies got it, so super anniversary day. We already had our net zero validated by SBTi prior to that. And we do have intermediate targets, etc., etc. But I won't talk about that because I would say, you know, my favorite hashtag in the world is from pledge to action. So I would rather talk about action and rather talk about action in the global south, because when you hear those pledges, you always think of European and West, the global north, what will they do? But what's exciting is we have a lot of things that we can do. And for example, we were discussing yesterday here in Egypt how we can do cement with a lot of calcium clay content, which is a way to replace clinker is a thing that makes a lot of CO2. So we are looking at how we can decarbonize the way we build everywhere, because our goals are global and not just from the north. And so very soon we will be doing that very low carbon cement in Egypt, which is about half of the CO2 of normal cement. But the other thing I would like to talk about, because versus the discussion that just happened, is how we use technology to look at how we can build faster with lower CO2. So in Malawi last year, we built a school with 3D printing. So you wouldn't think 3D printing such a technology in a country like Malawi. Why? Because Malawi is a shortage of about 40,000 schools. We can build that school, the walls, in 18 hours. So we can close the gap way, way quicker than with traditional methodology of construction, and much lower CO2 than traditional construction, because 3D printing use much less material. So we've now at the middle of building 52 affordable houses in Kenya, also using 3D printing. So that's the type of things that we can do, or we are doing right now.
Terrific. That's exciting to hear. Juan, could you tell us about balancing resilience and net zero in the implementation of housing projects?
I'll try. So some people say you have to spend money to make money, right? So sometimes you have to spend carbon to save carbon. We've just to put it in friendly terms, we've been doing a lot of retrofitting of existing housing, existing vulnerable housing, and incentivizing that to happen more for many reasons. One of them is resilience to climate and natural disasters, for sure, but also because these houses, as has been said here, are incrementally growing. They never stop being built. And we found that, yes, we also work on new construction and improving that, for sure, and improving the resilience and how that's built. But lately we've been focusing on this. We can't hear you? Okay. On improving existing housing, because many things, we know that improving an existing house will cost you 30% on average of replacing it with a new one. And in terms of carbon, we have been doing some studies, and improving an existing house, making it resilient, will not only improve the quality of life and make it resilient to housing, but it also saves you about half of the carbon emissions as opposed to replacing it with a new house. And let's not talk about new urban land, new services, and all of these things. So there's no worse resilience case than a house that has collapsed during a disaster that needs to be replaced, and that also entails economic losses, lives lost, livelihoods lost, and then all the mobilization that needs to happen to replace it. So that's we are working towards balancing it, to your question, by improving existing vulnerable housing.
Great, thanks so much. And then we heard a lot in our last panel about creating incentives, and so I wanted to switch over to talking about incentivizing resilience. Charlie Howden has been doing a lot of work around resilience finance. Can you address how that plays into resilience building efforts, and in particular how you're incentivizing clients of yours to invest in these kinds of products?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. I think it's really nice to be in a panel like this where actually people are talking about really insurance the whole time, you know, especially with Daniel last time as well. It's sort of quite rare for people in the insurance market to hear risk being talked about everywhere. And I think it's important because, you know, finance doesn't like volatility, you know, and we are in a more volatile world than we've ever been before. So what we've got to do to encourage finance into rebuild resilient, make things more resilient, make houses more resilient, is de-risk as much of that volatility as we can. And that adds certainty, and it provides guarantees, and it decreases the cost of finance inwards. So what I think, and it is a little bit to what Daniel was saying, I think he teed it up very nicely for me to say, look, the insurance market and the rest of finance is ready for that conversation. He's absolutely right. Because along with this extra volatility, there are new methods of pricing insurance which do exactly what Daniel said, which allow other people to put money on the table, which allows risk transfer to be available for finance into projects like this, where the recipients of that money are not necessarily the people who've paid the premium. So I think this is a sort of moment in time for us. We've got to use the sorts of tools that we've been using and which all corporates in the global north have been using to de-risk their buildings and de-risk their balance sheets for years, and make them available to the sorts of projects where the volatility is really hitting the world, which is in the global south. And now's the time to do it. And there is money available for that. There are models available for that to make it work. And there is finance ready to use these types of instruments to make them work better. So I think it's a perfect time to talk about all of this.
Great, let's do it. Would you like to share, regarding the building materials industry, how you're working with stakeholders to incentivize and encourage the transition to both more sustainable and resilient materials?
So I would like to start with the definition of sustainable and resilience material. And so I mentioned briefly how we were working on decarbonizing our cement, but I won't spend too much time on the technical. I don't think it's a place for that, but just call on me if you want to know more. I love talking about it. But on the resilience side, you really want to look at materials that will help houses, infrastructure, and everything else to withhold those climate events we are seeing happening more and more. I was in Philippines just recently where they were explaining how they had more than 20 typhoons over strength 4 in 2021 versus 1 or 2 previous years. So, but it's not just a global south problem, by the way. We start seeing a lot more impact in global north. So having a look at how we can build better and more resilience, and this is where I think concrete is usually quite well known to work well. So how do we do that? And for me, it's been a project, and back in the Philippines, I was just talking about where we are working to build a house where we mix. It's made of bamboo with help concrete to reinforce it. So that's a way to look at how can we make houses by mixing material where you find the resilience, but not at a super extra cost as you could do. And by the way, the 3D printed houses I was talking about are also pretty low in cost, but there's many other things we can look at, and we can look at things like the soil stabilization. I think it's a topic that never comes enough, because fantastic to have houses, but if you're not consolidating the soil around it, you could be in trouble very quickly. And same for all the roads that connect. So we have a product, I love that project, it's called Agrovia, where we actually mix that material directly with the soil without bringing new material or without displacing, and it makes it almost as strong as a asphalted road. And I think we need to look at the full system and how we can help with all these resilient. And I mean, I could go on this type of products because I'm so passionate about resilience and how the cement and concrete industry can have a absolutely key roles to play there. That please talk to me after the things, because if I go too long, Sarah is going to give me a hard time, but I could just speak for hours on that.
Great. So we've heard about the role that insurance has to play and also these sustainable building materials. Juan, how do you actually incentivize homeowners to want to make these changes and to build more resilient housing, and how do we make it more affordable and attainable for them to do so?
I got some hard questions today, didn't I? So, homeowners, you know, Daniel, I think, said it pretty well. I think the first thing is access to money. Somebody needs to pay for it, and people need money. Sometimes people think that's the only thing that's needed. Probably not. Many times, a house that has had money go into it is not necessarily resilient. So there's definitely money. There's definitely also technical assistance needs to happen. That needs to be available, made available by somebody. It's unlikely people will look for it themselves. So also information needs to be accessible, and policies need to be in place for that to happen. So it's a whole system approach. Definitely money is one of the main initial detonators of the whole system to start functioning, but it's not only money for materials and construction, it's also money for the people who will be supporting the community, for the community themselves to be able to use those materials and labor well, and to generate the information and the technical tools. You know, to fund people like us, here I am trying to get money from our corporate partners to do that, to be able to advise governments, the governments we work with, like the government of Dominica or Colombia, so that we can share learned experiences, and so that people can really benefit from all of this. It sounds easy, but it's not. There needs to be a transformation of the system that is intentional and well supported, because the system right now is mostly producing housing that is not resilient, and that is a problem that continues to grow. So we need to turn it around, and that will only happen at grassroots level. People need to want to have resilient housing. Usually people want it. Sometimes they can afford it. Sometimes they don't know how to do it. So those two things need to be made available by somebody else, like people like us, people like governments, or philanthropy and the people who sell materials or financial products.
Great, thank you. In closing, we can go whichever order, but I'd love to hear what one message do you want COP27 participants and also those who are live streaming with us today to take away on how we can advance solutions on climate resilient housing? What do we still need?
You want me to start? The one thing is, I think money has been a recurrent theme here. Finance, access to finance. I think that's a good place to start. That's where I'll start. And I'll put another tag to that money, and money for technical assistance, for information, for building. I want to recover what Daniel said. If a part of society is going to be disproportionately affected by the chaos that we are creating on the planet, no matter who did it or which part of that society it is, then another part needs to be disproportionately investing in making that right. So I think that is climate justice, and it's very applicable to resilient housing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's quite simple. We want to allow people who are exposed to the volatility and the climate change exposures of tomorrow to have access to the same sort of risk transfer tools that the rest of the world takes for granted. And that's not actually very difficult. It's about how donors allow charities to access financial markets. I think it's awful in a situation where you have charities of the world who are exposed and deal with disasters more than anywhere else, but don't have access to the same sorts of capital markets tools like insurance and others that everyone else has. So I'm hoping that part of the whole topic of implementation that we have at COP this year is that people start to look at the tools across the globe and go, actually, it's now the time we allow those types of organizations and those people to access the same sorts of products that everyone else takes for granted, because there is money for that out here.
We talk a lot about mitigation, and a lot of the thing we say as a building material company. So I won't talk about finance, not my domain. I will continue on my topic, which is building material. We talk a lot about mitigation, but I think the resilience and adaptation topic have to become central. So I'm glad to start hearing it. We don't talk about it enough. It has to be central, and when you hear the different people, solutions exist, financing exists. It seems that everything exists, and I just don't understand why it's not happening. So that radical collaboration that needs to happen, if we can't get out of this COP with that unprecedented type of collaboration happening, it would be absolutely criminal. We just wouldn't have done our job.
Agreed. All right, well, at this point, I would love to turn it back to my colleague, Monica, so we can talk about affordable housing in Africa. And we have a guest who's going to be joining us virtually for this next session. But thank you, Juan. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Magali.
Tight squeeze here. Thank you, everyone. So this is the Africa COP. It was important to us to make sure that we are also highlighting housing solutions in Africa, and so we hopefully have our virtual speaker joining us if technology decides to be cooperative, which it doesn't always. And this is Richard Bahumwire from Casa Real in Mozambique. Richard, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, everyone.
Hi,
Do you
Richard.
hear me?
Wonderful. So I'd love to introduce Richard. He's the executive director at Casa Real. Richard has over 10 years of experience in affordable housing and has worked in Burkina Faso, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Gambia, Guinea, Senegal, Togo, Mozambique, Rwanda, and Uganda. So he is a true Africa housing expert. He is going to do a spotlight today on the intersection between housing affordability and disaster resilience in Mozambique. Richard, we are thrilled to have you here. Please take it away. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing in Mozambique.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. And greetings from Mozambique, where I'm speaking to everyone from a second city called Beira, a city that is bordering the Indian Ocean. Those who don't know where Mozambique is in the southern African part, but is alongside the Indian Ocean, and the city we are building houses is below the sea level, and so you know what it means when it rains, and it's so prone. It's been so prone to floods until 2019, when cyclone Idai hit the city, and about 90% of the houses were destroyed, and especially the roofs. Many people, of course, lost their livelihoods, others' lives, among others. But of course, the key issue here, which also other presenters were referring to, the housing situation was already bad, because about more than 60% of the people live in informal settlements where they can afford to have space and to build. And when the cyclone hit the city, they were the most people that suffered a lot, that lost livelihoods, and bad sanitation, bad water, where it was already bad, and then it was worsened by that. It hit the city immediately after we had completed the showcase we had started with this project that we are completing now. And we had a few damages, although we had designed our houses to be resilient to floods. We didn't know, we didn't have any plans, any systems that we were talking about cyclone, because that was the first cyclone that hit the city. So because of good quality, at least we had some minor damages, but then immediately after the cyclone for building Beira better, we received different teams, different experts. And in the case of cyclone, we got friends from Australia, and then they trained our team on building resilient roofs and building better than before, than how everyone was building. And whenever we talk about cyclone resilience techniques, you know, when you talk about them, they sound so simple because, like, instead of using screws, nails, you use screws, and then you add some washer. It's a curved washer that we add on top of the screw, and then you tie the timber. You reduce the timber space, the trusses and the running space, and then you tie them with the metallic strap. That's how we managed to build that in up to now. Now we have completed about 96 houses, or affordable houses, and then we on a project of 150 housing units in the city that is prone to all these climate problems like floods, like cyclone. And the key thing here is not only talking about what does it mean having a resilient home, which you call affordable. Affordability, normally I tell people that it's not at the point of buying a house or at the point of building a house and selling it. Affordability goes up to even future. The sustainable affordable housing means that when someone comes to your company to buy a house, others use loans, others sell other things to be able to buy, and no bank, I normally say no bank is willing to fund a house that is going to be destroyed in the shortest period of time. When cyclone happened, some people had borrowed money from the bank. And so imagine someone is still paying, but people who didn't have resilient homes were destroyed. They lost their livelihoods, others lost jobs. And here the guy is still paying the loan and the house has been destroyed. So when we got the team that trained us in cyclone resilient building, we felt like this is the opportunity to really get it right. And we have been, all the houses we built, we've had now, since that cyclone died, we've had like 3 of them passing and not even a single scratch. And this has given us some hope that then at scale, you already have a team that has been trained, a team that is able to respond to such kind of climate challenges. And then it becomes a sustainable thing and it becomes attractive to the banks. We've had some MOUs with banks like Bank Absa, and Bank Absa normally was saying that the insurance was not even able to help them to recover the loans that they had disbursed to these houses that were destroyed, because it was a massive destruction that even government up to now is still trying to compensate at a slow pace, where they had donors donating to build Beira back better. But the key issue here is making sure that when you are building for sale, when you are building a house, it might not be cyclone in your case. It might be, I heard one of you talking about typhoons in the Philippines. It might be earthquakes. The greatest thing is when you're designing to design a resilient home. At the beginning of the buying is a little difficult, because of course anything you add on the house, it adds the cost. But like this for cyclone, we actually still used the same materials that we were using, only that we added different techniques like I have mentioned. And then we added the isolation underneath, actually, which is now helping also to cut down temperatures in Beira, which is so hot. We have done some also tests on using timber, which we call cross-laminated timber, in order to reduce carbon. And we are now testing hempcrete. I think you have heard about hempcrete, which consumes carbon instead of emitting carbon to the environment. And we hope that with all the innovations that we are doing, with all the resilience that we are building, we hope that we will be attractive to investors, and then we can go to scale. This is our mission. So build sustainably, because sustainable is not at a time when people are buying the houses, but for the future, and especially those who will be targeting mortgages and investors. Thank you very much. If there is a question.
Thank you, Richard. No, I think that's, I mean, he raised a lot of points. All of the speakers today have raised some incredible points. So I want to first off thank everyone who participated in this panel, helped, you know, not only speak, but also contribute to the development of the panel. That is leading us to the end of our session for today. I asked my speakers to be short and impactful, and they were that. So they exactly fulfilled the mission. So you know, we've talked a lot today about risk transfer. We've talked about financing. We've talked about sustainable construction materials and the need to develop long-term incentives. I would encourage all of you to take all of these thoughts and all of these calls to action with you as you're engaging in the rest of COP and beyond. I think, you know, the most resilient house is one that already exists. We know that. We need that. We need to be improving our houses so that they can withstand the extreme weather and disasters that are coming our way. I mentioned at the beginning of the session the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda. It was published. I encourage you to take a look at it, learn about what, you know, the global climate community is doing to accelerate action, in particular in the housing space. But it's really only the start. So I think the big question is, where do we go from here? For us, we push forward. I would encourage you, so last year we launched the Climate Resilient Housing Initiative. We're accelerating action within the Race to Resilience to showcase opportunities of excellence by state action, but also show all of the actors that are behind that, you know, everybody that's contributing in the non-state realm to push towards greater state action around resilient housing. I would encourage you to join us. You can scan our little dinosaur up there if you'd like to. We're highlighting, you know, partnerships between governments and sector partners like those we have on stage. So get engaged, talk to me about how you can get involved to join us. And if you have a case study about an excellent housing resilience innovation study, please let us know. We want to talk to you. We want to showcase these kinds of initiatives so that we can spread the message of what does resilient housing look like in practice and how do we emulate that in other parts of the world. The other thing, I would encourage you, you know, to see some of the other sessions that we're organizing at Build Change. Just to preview some of the other sessions at COP on November 14th, right here in this room. We are talking about how to save embodied carbon through housing upgrading. My colleague Juan mentioned that briefly. We have found that it saves up to 60% in embodied carbon. So find out, you know, how we came to those numbers and what we can do from there. On November 15th, we're co-hosting a session with our friends at the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure on assessing risk and resilience. And then on November 17th, join us for a final recap on housing at COP with a solutions circle in the locally led adaptation pavilion. This is really a reflection of what have these past 2 weeks looked like in COP. We have some folks in this room who will be fire starter speakers, but everyone will have a chance to contribute and to talk about their own reflections on what the housing landscape has looked like at COP. We would love to see you. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a long day, and so I hope you get some rest and come ready for further housing action at COP tomorrow and throughout the next few weeks. Take care.